Let us bring in our guests. In Atlanta, Georgia, we have Joshua Edmonds. He's the executive director of the anti-abortion group, the Georgia Life Alliance, and he was involved in drafting the bill. Also in Atlanta is Krystal Redman. She's the executive director of the pro-abortion rights group Spark Reproductive Justice Now. And Mary Ziegler joins us from Tallahassee, Florida. She's a law professor and author of the book After Roe, The Lost History of the Abortion Debate. I thank you all for joining us. Krystal, how much of a loss is this law to you and your movement?
I wouldn't say this is a loss because the bill has not been enacted into law. I believe it's set to go into law at the top of 2020. So right now, as every other fight in reproductive health rights and justice, we continue to take the next steps in this fight. We just know that this fight is a lot longer than we initially planned for, but our next step now is to definitely be alongside as some of our partners pursue legal actions to the state of Georgia.
Okay. Although it was signed into law, yes, it will only be enacted later on, but it went from being a bill to a law because the governor signed it, right? Brian Kemp. Joshua Edmonds, are you proud of this legislation?
Right, Kemp did sign.
Absolutely. You know, when you look at what science tells us, that in the womb, at the moment of fertilization, there is a genetically whole, unique, living human being, and that the current law in Georgia allows for children with beating hearts up to 20 weeks old, 5 months in the womb, to be killed in abortion. And then you see the strides forward that we've made in this kind of legislation to protect those children in the womb with beating hearts. This is absolutely a victory, and we're so proud that Governor Kemp followed through on signing this legislation last week.
Krystal, the measure makes some exceptions in the case of rape and incest if a woman files a police report first and to save the life of the mother. With that in mind, do you find some consolation, or are you against it completely?
No, not at all. I'm against it, and please call me by my title, Dr. Redman. I know that if folks are talking about medical science, we need to actually discuss what the medical implications of the bills truly means to people here in Georgia, and we can get into that if that's something you want to discuss. But specifically regarding these exceptions to this new law, no, I don't think that this is something that, especially as reproductive justice leaders and providers, that we're excited about. I think this causes further harm to people who already are in a most difficult situation to begin with.
Mary Ziegler, Roe versus Wade in 1973 made abortion legal nationwide. Is that now going to come under scrutiny because of what's happening in Georgia and other states?
I think that's both the hope and the expectation of legislators who are passing laws like the one on the books in Georgia. And the reason it's happening now, as opposed to several years ago, is that the Supreme Court's composition has changed. We now have 2 new members of the court nominated by President Trump. And I think many experts, myself included, expect the court to eventually overturn Roe, maybe not formally, maybe in substance, not in form. I think the question is how and when. And so there's actually a division, I think, among pro-life forces or abortion opponents about exactly what the best strategy is to get the court to overturn Roe. And exactly when it's going to happen.
Right. So, Krystal, where Republicans control states, they're going to push for this, right? We've seen similar bills in Kentucky, in Ohio, in Mississippi. They're preparing them in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Alabama. How do you fight back when state after state is pushing for this?
Well, I believe just like states have their strategies, movement leaders, people that are on the ground have our strategies too as well. And this is something that's not new. We know that attacks on bodies, specifically Black and brown bodies, and folks who have been historically most oppressed, have always occurred here. Not just in Georgia, not just in Ohio, but throughout our nation. So we know that this fight is not a new fight, and we've always built collective strategy, and we'll continue to build those strategies.
Joshua, I'm looking at Alabama, who are drafting a bill where there's no exemptions for rape or incest, 99 years in prison for a doctor performing an abortion. Would you agree that that's a bit extreme?
Well, you know, Georgia's law, when it was originally introduced in the legislature, didn't have any exceptions in the bill. And the reason is, if you look at the language of our bill, we state right at the beginning of Section 2 that a child in the womb is counted as a natural person in our law because science tells us at the moment of fertilization that a child is a unique, living, genetically whole human being. And if we believe that those children deserve protection under law because they're a person, then we shouldn't make any exceptions for that. And so, with the current law allowing to abort a child up to 5 months old in the womb, we recognize that it was important for us to take that step to go back to when the heart begins and to make no exceptions. And it was once the bill went through the committee process that the exceptions were added in our bill.
And the Supreme Court of the United States, Joshua, recognizes a woman's right to an abortion until 24 weeks. So clearly you have a problem with that. Would you only consider this a victory for you and your movement if you can go all the way up to the Supreme Court and change that?
Well, we wrote and introduced this law with the intent of it going into effect in Georgia. And something that makes our law a little bit different from the other states who have passed similar legislation is, like I mentioned, in our bill, we actually recognize that a child in the womb is a natural person. And because of that, we're recognizing that there should be some protections in place to restrict access to aborting babies at 5 months, like the current law allows. And so if that bill, if that law is seen before the courts, I think it'll be a bit of a novel question, because we're not just talking about regulating one procedure, but we're talking about whether or not the child in the womb is a person, like was discussed in the Roe proceedings in 1973, when Justice Blackmun said that if personhood were established for the child, then his right to life would be guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, and abortion rights case would fall apart. So that's the prerogative behind the bill, is to establish personhood rather than just regulate a medical procedure.
Krystal, when we hear Joshua, he leans on science a lot and says, well, science tells us when a child is a child and when somebody should be protected, somebody's life should be protected. From your perspective, how do you feel about that? Is he correct in his scientific approach?
Well, first, I would like to remind you, please address me by Dr. Redman. And also, absolutely not, he's not correct in his approach. I don't know if the person has any medical background that's speaking, or has anything to do with patient care, or anything in reproductive health or maternal and child health. I would argue maybe not, or is in medical science. But no, medical science tells us at a point of viability, that's when personhood is determined. And at 6 weeks, at 12 weeks, at 11 weeks, whatever the restriction is, but specifically here in Georgia, up to 6 weeks, that's not the point of viability.
Okay.
That's what medical science tells us, that this is, at this point, it is fetal tissue. It is not, as the person spoke, a child. When you speak about medical science, you speak about child. Even if you approach the CDC's definition of child and childhood, it is not at a point of in your womb.
Okay.
So if we were going to speak about terminology and refer back to medical science, please then address what specifically medical science says,
Okay.
and give references.
Okay, and Krystal, my apologies if you were offended. I didn't even know you're a doctor, so if you are a medical doctor, I apologize. The title I have for you is Krystal Redman, Executive Director of the
Yes.
of Spark Reproductive Justice, and I will call you Dr. Redman from here on in. And the reason I ask you this, right, and I'm going to bring you in a second, Mary, but Krystal, one of the reasons, Dr. Redman, I ask you this is because a lot of people who are for reproductive rights and for a woman's choice to abort claim that the other side uses science, but it's actually just religion claiming science. Is that how you feel?
I don't necessarily know if it's religious claiming science. I am in the business of recognizing true medical science and public health research, so I don't know where these data points come from. I'm a person that has been in the hearings here in Georgia and have heard testimonies from my medical colleagues with ACOG, and just medical colleagues with large medical institutions here that do provide abortion care services. And I have personally given testimony, and I have not heard or seen any research from some folks on opposition have stated. And even in these hearings, our current lawmakers and folks question where do these data points come from, and we haven't gotten a clear answer. So I don't want to be in the business of questioning where the data points come from. I'm in the business more so of understanding and upholding the true science that has been published and documented, and continues to be articulated from the medical professionals that are in my circle.
Joshua, is your position a religious one dressed up as science?
Well, like I mentioned, science tells us, and I believe every credible medical scientist would say, that the human lifespan begins at the moment of fertilization. We don't get a human from a non-human. The law of biogenesis tells us that humans reproduce more humans. And so anyone who took 8th grade biology could tell you that at the moment of fertilization, there is a genetically unique, whole, living human being
Okay,
in the womb.
Joshua,
I don't know that there's
Joshua,
any
you're,
data
you're
point
talking
that would
about it as
deny
if
that
it's an
argument.
established fact around the world. Yes, there's debate about when a child becomes viable. That's why we're having this debate, and it's been debated forever and ever, right? It's not something that's uniformly accepted and universally accepted around the world. Would you concede that?
I would not. I believe that it's universally accepted that life begins at the moment of fertilization. That is a genetically whole, living human being at fertilization. Viability is simply the point that the child could live externally from the womb, which, as science progresses in our country and around the world, that number goes back earlier and earlier in pregnancy. And so because science tells us life begins at fertilization, common sense tells us that our law should recognize the right to life of that child earlier and earlier, which is what we did with this bill.
Mary Ziegler, this is one of those debates that's a signpost of the culture wars in the United States. Tell me why we're having this discussion in the year 2019.
In some ways, we've always been having this discussion. I think I'm a historian of this debate, and if you start before Roe v. Wade, frankly, you would have very similar debates about whether personhood is a legal concept, a medical concept, or a philosophical concept. What I think has changed in part, there are two things. I think first that the court has changed, and what would have been kind of long shot bills, and in my opinion, I think may still be long shot bills, now are appealing to lawmakers in a way that they wouldn't have before. And secondly, I think the political calculus has changed. I think that for example, in the 1990s or the early 2000s, I think a lot of lawmakers who would have deemed themselves either pro-choice or pro-life would have been trying to reach to the middle on this issue and to paint the other side as kind of extremist. And now I think you see really pro-choice and pro-life legislators reaching for the extremes and hoping to win at the ballot box, not by appealing to the kind of mushy middle of voters, but instead to appeal to their base and kind of excite people who care the most deeply about these issues. So I think what you're seeing is a point on a continuum, but what has changed, I think, is the type of legislation you're seeing passed and considered in the states.
Dr. Redman, what would you advise women who are considering abortions right now in Georgia, and now they've read the news and they know that the state is firmly against it?
Yeah, I think that people in Georgia who are considering abortion as a medical option to continue to reach out to your providers, reach out to advocate groups that can provide you with resources to whatever decision you decide, including a medical decision to have an abortion.
Joshua Edmonds, what don't people get about your position?
You know, I think that it's important to understand that policy like the Life Act is being written and enacted in a context that Georgia is trying to create a culture that respects life and that protects women and children and families. You know, this year, in addition to the Life Act, we also passed and signed legislation that prevents shackling pregnant inmates in Georgia. We also wrote $2 million of a state grant into our state budget that provides money to pregnancy health organizations to provide free care and services to women in low-income areas in Georgia who are looking for help and don't just want to go seek out an abortion and be charged for medical care when they go into facilities like Planned Parenthood. We also had in 2016 a law, the Rape Survivor Custody Act, that denies parental rights to rapists who get women pregnant. And we also even wrote in $91 million new into our state budget to try to crack down on the maternal mortality crisis that Georgia's facing. So it's easy for headlines to isolate this issue into a vacuum and make it look one way or another for political talking points. But Georgia is leading the nation in trying to pass policy that respects women and children, protects life, and creates a culture that allows our families to thrive here in Georgia.
Mary Ziegler, even though each state looks at this individually, does it matter who's in charge in the White House? Come next year, if a Bernie Sanders becomes president, is this debate going to swing the other way?
Well, I think it could. One of the questions, I think, right, is if there's going to be 5 votes to uphold a bill like the one in Georgia. And if you ask me to bet right now, I would say not very soon. I think Chief Justice Roberts, who's the apparent swing vote, has been very clear that he cares about the court's reputation as a nonpartisan institution, which I don't think means he will be interested in upholding Roe. I do think it means he would be interested in going pretty slow in dismantling Roe in a way that would make it look like the court took precedent seriously. So I don't, for that reason, see him deciding in the next year that a law like Georgia's was constitutional. So if, for example, Bernie Sanders were elected, you could theoretically have a retirement or death of another justice who might move the court even further to the right and make someone other than Chief Justice Roberts the swing vote. That's really the only significance I can see, because I presume we already have 5 votes to dismantle Roe. I just would be surprised if it happens as quickly or as explicitly as potentially some of the other panelists might.
Right. Okay. Well, it's been really good talking to all of you. Joshua Edmonds, Dr. Krystal Redman, and Mary Ziegler. Thanks for joining us here on the Newsmakers.